So this is the second part of this week's topic of principles of environmental management. In the first part, I introduced the concept of ecosystem-based management and listed four principles which I wanted to explore in more detail. We gave you a couple of examples of integration. The rest of this video, we will discuss the remaining three: adaptation, precaution, and sustainability. So the first is adaptation. So if we think about how we learn and how we act on what we know, let's start at the bottom first, is that most humans actually operate and learn from really unmonitored experience and through casual observations, anecdotes, and this leads us to models of reality, which we often then put into a context of a political context. I mean, this is very appropriate in terms of the present discussions of alternative facts and the like today, and that without regard to practicality or feasibility. This is the human condition for most of our existence, and it's got us to survive. But it's really the part of being more systemic about it that's helped us advance our society. And the next step, of course, is trial and error. Try something, see if it works, adjust accordingly. We've been doing this for a long time as well. So this is a problem-oriented observation rather than just casual observations that's directed in that way. And that leads to empirical knowledge that works, but may be inconsistent and surprising because the trial and error approaches may lead us to some understanding which it doesn't comport to reality in all cases, or the conditions may change. Let's go up to the top. As we as scientists are trained to do experiments, laboratory experiments where we control the observations and to infer a cause. And that leads to us to, over time, to develop a theory that has a range of applicability that may be narrow because it's determined by the conditions under which the experiments were conducted. Of course, we're dealing with experiments in nature by making decisions about human activities or interventions that we want to restore an environment. And so here we think about this as doing experiments mainly on a larger scale. This is what we mean by adaptive management, quasi-experiments in the field. We'll talk more about what this means. This is the area that moves beyond trial and error to approaches that are experimental, in which we emphasize systematic monitoring to detect surprises. And that leads not to theory, but to strong inferences that may have limits because they may not produce timely prediction or control. So this is the context of adaptive management, given this range, this gradient of how we learn from unmonitored experience to laboratory experimentation. So the elements of adaptive management, that the objectives that we have in management are regularly revisited and revised. We don't just mindlessly pursue one objective if it's not achievable, or we need to find other ways to reach it. All of these approaches involved some model or models of how the system we are trying to manage will perform. We have, in the Chesapeake Bay example, a large set of models that help us understand, for example, if we reduce nutrients by this amount, this will be the effect on water quality or living resources. Then the adaptive approach means that we need to not be so locked on one choice, but actually explore a range of management choices and experimentally determine which is the most effective. So monitoring and evaluation of outcomes is really critical in adaptive management. And we need also, I mean, we could do this and produce reports, but if there isn't a mechanism for incorporating this learning into future decisions, it won't work. And in the world in which we live, of course, is that we need to bring collaboration by stakeholders, managers, broader elements of society need to participate in this. It just can't be solely technical scientific endeavor. So if we think about the types of management that we want to deal with here, one is that we we manage now by reacting. So a change in policy results. There's legal public criticism, legal activity, and so we change the policy. We react to the conditions that prevail. Adaptive management is a more thoughtful way in which we could learn by doing to develop a more robust management. And the way we often do it when we begin to apply adapt, this is what we're doing in the Chesapeake Bay region, is that there's a deliberate attempt to evaluate a single policy. We have one TMDL that we're trying to put in. We don't have 4 Chesapeake Bays to experiment on, or even 4 subestuaries. We have one management approach we're pursuing, and we're trying to assess the outcome and make some changes on the way, a passive adaptive management strategy. Active adaptive management would work where we have maybe, certain forest stands or subestuaries or, creeks that we might want to manage differently, subwatersheds, in a more truly experimental way, and that we deliberately evaluate policy alternatives. We do something in one treatment and something else in another, and to manage those like we would as scientists in an experiment. As we think about the evolution of this approach, though, we need to also think about anticipatory management, management that builds on an adaptive learning process, but seeks robust policies that, even if there are uncertainties, they're designed to win. Minimizing the deleterious outcome, maximizing the robust nature of the solutions that we suggest. So this is a broader framework for where adaptive management fits in. So adaptive management cycle, you'll see various ways that these are illustrated, generally in a cycle, a circle. We can define the problem. We establish goals and objectives. The Chesapeake Bay, we had an impaired water quality. We said we want to improve it to meet these water quality objectives. We developed a model or models that relate our actions to these established goals. We select actions that are taken on. We implement those actions. We monitor them, design and monitor them. We analyze and synthesize the results. We communicate, and then we adapt. We can go back and redefine the problem, or this cycle can be shortcut back to establishing new goals. We can improve our models, or we can find more effective actions. So monitoring is critical, but so is modeling. We have to have some models of the system, how the system is expected to perform, and then we need to manage by learning, test the outcomes in order to improve the results or change our models or objectives. This is the essence of adaptive management. So let us move on to the precautionary principle. So if consequences of an action are unknown but are judged as really being of high risk, or we don't want to take a chance, is it better not to allow those proposed activities to take place rather than to risk the uncertain but possibly negative consequences? We think of this in the kind of drug testing, for example, that regime that we have to have a fairly high level of confidence that the outcomes won't be deleterious before we pursue them. The release of certain toxic compounds in the environment in a similar way. When an activity raises threats to human health, harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. So it shifts the burden from requiring proof of negative consequences. We should be allowed to do that unless it's shown that it's harmful, to the opposite, so that we can oppose an action to requiring proof of the absence of negative consequences in order to allow that action. The history of this, of course, is based on medicine. The Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. But also in environmental policy, the Germans put this principle into their environmental laws back in the 1970s. There was a classic agreement among the states around the North Sea that had to do with ocean disposal of waste from industrial processes that was fought over, and the decision was made that no, we need to take precaution. We have to actually be able to demonstrate the lack of effect rather than an effect before we take action. It's built into international agreements. So the UN agreements, the Rio Declaration back in '92 had the precaution concept built into it. And really, it's built into a variety of federal laws, from the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, Occupational Safety Act, and Health Act, and the Pollution Prevention Act, and even the recent versions of the Sustainable Fisheries Act have this precautionary sense in them. It's applied to persistent pollutions, things like asbestos. We have to remediate buildings from asbestos. We're not going to take a risk. Dioxin, very highly toxic issues. Endangered species, of course, where we get them to the level of risk where we're not going to take action, prohibit actions that could harm them. Genetically modified organisms, AIDS. I could go on. And also we have to then think of it in the context of climate change. Even faced with the uncertainties about our emissions and what kind of effects on climate and what those effects what might mean, and we don't know them precisely, but should we not avoid the risk? So this approach has been criticized is impractical. Everything requires some risk. I mean, when I make a decision when I cross the street, that I judge the speed and direction of the oncoming traffic and have some reasonable assurance that I can make it forward, but it's not guaranteed. Has been only applied generally to new technologies or actions. So how can it be applied to solutions? Work I do down in the Mississippi Delta, where river diversions, diverting water back into the bays and estuaries and wetlands, is seen as a really critical element of the solution. But there's a risk to endangered or threatened, I should say, marine mammal local populations. How far do we carry this issue of precaution? It does not take into account the potential benefits. So the calculation is kind of one-sided. It's not a cost-benefit approach. And then it can be used as protectionism or Luddism, that we don't want any new technologies and that will slow human progress. So these are some of the criticisms of the concept of the precautionary principle. So the last thing I want to talk about is sustainability. Defined in the dictionary as able to be maintained at a certain rate or level, or able to be upheld or defended. So you could think of the idea of maintaining a fishery at a sustainable level, where the harvest can be sustained over a long period of time, maintained at that level, or a solution which is robust when it has to deal with challenges in effect and is able to defend itself and be upheld. Most importantly, in the context of environmental policy, it's baked into the principle of UN declarations for sustainable development. It is development that meets the need of present generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet the needs. So the concept of sustainability has built into it this multi-generational time frame. You just can't think about whether this is sustainable over the next few years, but are we doing things to manage the environment, consume resources, which don't compromise the ability of subsequent generations to do the same? And then lastly, I throw this idea here just is an interesting example, because at the Arizona State University, they're so focused on this notion of sustainability. They have a school of sustainability. And so the dean, and on their go to the website, says their goal is to improve human well-being and ensure social equity for present and future generations while safeguarding the planet's life support system. Another way of looking at it. So one concept of sustainability that's come into popular discussion of recent years is this notion of resilience, the capacity of a system to undergo disturbance and maintain its functions and controls. Takes a licking and keeps on ticking, if you think of it that way. And it's used for materials. When we bend something, if it snaps back to its original shape, it's a resilient material. We think about it in social or psychological state. There's abundant literature on resilience of people in terms of their psychological health and well-being, as well as their social fabric. It's commonly used with respect to the economy. Do we have a resilient economy? Is Wall Street able to come back quickly? For example, we think of it now also in terms of communities that might be affected by some disruption, whether it's a hurricane or the abandonment of a factory or industry within the area. Is that community resilient? It's also talked about now, particularly about coastal vulnerability. In an era of climate change, what is the infrastructure and what are the communities resilient to a storm surge and a hurricane impact? Can it survive? Can it return quickly? These are the notions, as well as ecosystems. So, for example, in this idea of an ecosystem resilience, and the idea of troughs and ridges is often used in this concept of thinking about resilience. So, if the ecosystem can kind of stay in the valley and it will maintain its integrity, but if it's forced out, for example, here is the concept of the Chesapeake Bay before this disruptive hurricane of Agnes. It's been thrown out of that zone of stability, of resilience, and put into a new stable state, a more degraded system. It's actually hard to get it out. So it's fairly resilient in the concept where it is. Will the restoration activities move it to some future stable state? So this notion of resilience is a good part, is also an important dimension of our notions of sustainability. So the four critical aspects of resilience, the difficulty of how difficult it is to change the system. It's hard to make it different by an external force or pressure. How precarious is it with respect to, is it near a limit or a threshold that could be kicked over and out of? Is it have a wide latitude? The amount of a system can be changed before losing its ability to recover? Or those valleys that I painted out in that simple diagram very broad, or are they very narrow? And this notion of panarchy, which is, okay, we have stability within this, resilience within this one construct, but what if there's something that changes the whole landscape? Species invasions, market shifts, global climate change can trigger these surprises and regime shifts, change the geography of that the contours of resilience that I showed you in that simple two-dimensional diagram. So we have now struggling with the Chesapeake Bay. We're trying to restore its water quality, but we want also a bay which the ecosystem is resilient to future shocks and changes. So here, this picture on the right here is of the Susquehanna Flats, which was pretty well decimated by the 72 tropical storm. It's now slowly recovered. And a storm, in 2011, which was almost as bad as the one in 1972, sure knocked it back a little bit, but not out. And that's because the plants themselves are controlling their fate by stilling the water, trapping sediments, improving water clarity is a notion of how those ecosystems have become more resilient. So can we find resilient outcomes in our quest for sustainability? So finally, let me just say, bringing all this together, let me challenge you to think about your own projects that you're doing for your thesis or you'll write up for this course, and place the topic in the context of the larger ecosystem, not just the narrow issues you're struggling with, including humans, but to be sure that you integrate your knowledge with other relevant knowledge. Don't be so myopic and thinking about only your field of knowledge or study. How do we bring other information into it? How do we integrate? How do we best know whether solutions are working or need to be adjusted? How can we adapt to the approaches, making sure we're making measurements and using those in a way to correct our approach as we go down the road? What are the appropriate levels of caution? What are the trade-offs of being highly overcautious, if you will? And how can the solutions be sustainable and resilient?